So 500 years ago, Europeans and Africans met for the first time on the shore. This encounter created the slave trade, which involves the capturing of Africans down to their exports. This incident was formally seen as custom in African tradition as a situation in which humans are exchanged with food items or any other important and valuable item, and this transaction is known as trade by barter. The exploitation of Africa and mineral resources humans by Europeans started after the invasion of Europeans in Africa. Many Africans, especially the greedy ones, sees it as an opportunity to gain what they have not gained before. That is when an offer started rolling on their table, especially the African chiefs, kings, and leaders across the African continent. Offers were presented to them on the note that if they are able to give them their brothers, they will be able to get some items in return. What are these items? These items include some objects like pots. These items include some objects like spoon. Not just items, not just spoon and pots. These items also include gun. You may wonder, you may ask, what does an African man need gun to do? But out of greediness, our chiefs, kings who are meant to protect their brothers from any form of harm, started capturing their brothers and selling to Europeans. Something that was formerly known and seen as an African method of buying and selling became and turned out to be slaves, slave trade, which took over 12 million Africans exploited.
"500 years ago, Europeans and Africans met for the first time on these shores. The encounter created the slave trade and changed the world. The slave trade remains a missing chapter in our history, yet Britain led the world in the exploitation of human cargo. This story is not just one of slave raiding by Europeans, but slave trading by Africans. Greed led African kings to sell 12 million people across the ocean. This is not a tale of a trade which grew by accident, but one of a global business created by royal appointment.
The Royal African Company is to be incorporated to set to sea as many ships as shall be thought fitting for the buying, selling and bartering of gold, silver, negroes, slaves.
Nor is it simply the story of passive, suffering Negroes freed by heroic white crusaders, but one of black uprising. And above all, this is not a tale of a dead past. It still shapes the way Britons live today.
William Beckford and his father, Alderman Beckford, to put it bluntly, owned my ancestors.
It brings some Britons face to face with a heritage they've never before confronted.
My grandfather was what I'd consider probably a very charming man, and in his young days he was quite a dish. Actually, he really was.
And for the first time, Britons, black and white, discover a common ancestry. It's an ancestry rooted in a past when British ships carried African slaves. Bristol. This sleepy port was once a mercantile powerhouse which dominated the transatlantic slave trade. Ships that wrenched millions of Africans from their homes crowded the Avon for a century. Yet a visitor today sees a city stripped of any reminder of that cargo. Bristol has turned its back on the trade that made it rich.
I was simply amazed by the fact that there was no recognition that Bristol's wealth lay in the Atlantic trade. In vain, I went to the museum, for example, to see whether there was a display there. Not a word of it. I looked at my university and saw whether anyone was teaching it. Not a bit of it. I talked to people in the street, and they were completely ignorant of it. And I think that really in the 20th century, Bristol went through a long period of denial that there really was, as it were, a participation in this wider world.
The city's authorities have long resisted efforts, especially by the black communities, to mark its slave trading past.
There has been a genuine fear in Bristol of what the consequences would be if the truth were known. And part of the fear was generated, I think, was because the people who had the control over whether that history came out or not actually didn't know themselves what the extent and the nature of Bristol's involvement was. And I think it's more fear than denial.
But in early March this year, the first sign of change appeared. Bristol's dignitaries gathered for the opening of a new footbridge. It was a small step, but a victory for the campaign to commemorate one of the slaves who lived in Bristol, a man called Perot Jones.
We are here with our friends to show our respect to our ancestors who lived and died in this city as enslaved Africans. It's often not known that in 1725, Bristol alone enslaved 16,550 Africans in that 1 year.
It's a bridge that helps us come to terms with, to understand, and sometimes to confront a shared past. A past that contains, for many of us, great sadness.
This moment is a sign that Britain is waking up to its slave trading history. Perot Jones belonged to a Bristol family, the Pinneys. Britain's slave past does not start with Africa. It begins in 17th century England with the British Empire's first slaves, white men. The founder of the Pinney dynasty, Azariah, was farming in Dorset when he was swept up in a rebellion against the king.
The Duke of Monmouth landed in Lyme Regis in June 1685, and Azariah, probably tired of haymaking, saw these redcoats crossing the end of the field and thought that looked rather more fun than haymaking, and why don't I go and join them? And off he went. And in July of 1685, he fought the disastrous Battle of Sedgemoor. The Duke of Monmouth was executed, and a very large number of others were executed too. Some were transported, and Azariah, my ancestor, was one of those lucky ones. being sent to the island of Nevis as an indented servant, which meant he was more or less a slave himself.
When Azariah Pinney landed, the island of Nevis was little more than untamed bush. The English convicts were put to work alongside native Indians and a few imported Africans. They cleared the island, first for tobacco, then for a new luxury crop, sugar.
At that time, the West Indies was something like a gold rush. There was this new chance to make quite a lot of money quite quickly, and a lot of people came out from this country to do it. And in fact, they employed Negroes imported from Africa as slaves, and they employed, after the Battle of Sedgemoor, quite a large number of white people who were indented servants like Asa.
Azariah persuaded his sister to buy him out of servitude. Within a year, she had set him up in the sugar business. He quickly saw that convicts and Indians could not survive the harsh conditions, but his own time in the fields had shown him where the answer lay: Africa.
Large numbers of Negroes were shipped from Africa to the West Indies, and the African or the Negro population increased, and the white population decreased.
Within 2 generations, his heir, John Pinney, was meticulously recording the purchase of African slaves for his booming plantations, including one he named Pero Jones.
I desire you to take the earliest opportunity of buying me 10 new Negroes. Never let them be younger than 10 years, and never let them be as old as 30 if you can help it. Get them at St. Kitts or any other islands where they may be had best and cheapest.
His grandfather's enslavement probably made John Pinney uneasy about owning slaves, but the scriptures stilled his conscience.
I can assure you I was shocked at the first appearance of human flesh
exposed to sale. But surely God ordained them for the use and benefit of us. Otherwise his divine will would have been made manifest by some particular sign or token.
He was motivated by commerce, but in doing so, it seems that he regarded his slaves as his principal asset, and he looked after his asset. I flatter myself to say a word respecting the care of my slaves and stock. Your own good sense must tell you they are the sinews of a plantation, and must claim your particular care and attention.
Humanity tempered with justice towards the former must ever be exercised. They surely deserve it, being the very means of our support.
They should be kept clean of ticks.
The demand for the Pinnish sugar was huge. To meet the demand, they needed more slaves, but they had to raise cash to buy those slaves. They turned to the merchants in the City of London for help. The moneymen were prepared to give loans to planters, but it was the higher profits from the slave ships that offered the best returns. The city wanted that business all to itself. The king was always ready to trade favours for cash. He granted a royal charter which gave a single London company, the Royal African Company, exclusive rights over the slave trade. In return, the royal family became its biggest shareholders.
Charles II, by the grace of God, King of England, Scotland, France, and Ireland. To all to whom these presents shall come, greeting. Whereas Guinea, Benin, Angola, and South Barbary, and the sole and only trade and traffic thereof, are the undoubted right of our heirs and successors, and whereas the trade of said regions is of great advantage to subjects of this kingdom. The Royal African Company is to be incorporated in the name of our dearest brother, James Duke of York, His Highness Prince Rupert, Anthony Earl of Shaftesbury, Henry Earl of Arlington, His Grace the Duke of Buckingham, John Earl of Bath. we hereby grant unto the same Royal African Company of England to set to sea as many ships as shall be thought fitting for the buying, selling, and bartering of gold, silver, negroes, slaves, goods, ware, and manufactures.
The company's men would let nothing stand in the way of their drive for profits. They already knew that slavery was widely practiced in West Africa. In most African nations, it was an alternative to a prison system.
Those who committed crimes, convicts, could be sold into slavery. If you owed a debt, you could be sold into slavery. Sometimes through deceit, or you could be tricked into slavery.
Slaves were also acquired as captives of Africa's wars. Europeans had long been part of an established system for bartering them.
The first Europeans who came to Ghana were the Portuguese, and they arrived in 1471. And when they got here, they found that there was a brisk trade in slaves between Ghana and its West African neighbors. And for 100 years, Portugal remained on the coast of Ghana and took part in this coastal trade, going to Senegal, bringing goods from Senegal, from Nigeria to Ghana, and bringing slaves in exchange for gold. And this was a situation before the transatlantic slave trade was introduced.
The Royal African Company had no interest in the coastal trade. They wanted slaves to ship across the Atlantic. They found a ready supply in local prisoners of war.
When you went to war and you defeated the people, you took captives home. So you decided what to do with the captives. How many slaves do we need for farming? How many do we need for the army? How many do we need for domestic work, etc., etc.? After they've gone through all those logistics, the excess goes through the Atlantic slave trade.
The image we have today of the slave trade as mass kidnap by Europeans couldn't be further from the truth. For both sides, this was just business.
The African role in the transatlantic slave trade must not be swept under the carpet. The greed factor was there. Kingdoms made money, they rose as a result of the trade. Big, powerful people, rich families were created as a result of the Africans who were active collaborators in the trade.
The company found that African kings were just as greedy as England's own royal family. They were willing to supply exactly what the plantations needed.
The slave owners in the West Indies, they preferred slaves from the Gold Coast because they said these were very hard-working, hardy slaves.
Local businesses sprang up to supply the transatlantic market. The European traders had no need to round up the slaves.
The Europeans themselves did not go inland to the villages or to the town to capture slaves. They remained at the forts and the castles. And it was the African traders who sold the slaves to the Europeans. Now, what happened was that there were middlemen who would meet the inland traders bringing the slaves. They would buy these slaves and then in turn resold them to the European merchants in the castles.
Rival European powers were building castles to protect their cargoes. Within a century, there would be a fort every 3 miles on what used to be called the Gold Coast. It came to be known as the Slave Coast. The Royal African Company appealed to its major shareholder, James II. He began a string of garrisons, motivated possibly by the national interest, but more likely by his own profits. Every time a British ship was sighted, its sailors could rely on a welcome from the fort and from the African settlement next to it.
We took up our old anchorage opposite Cape Coast Castle and made arrangements for commencing our old business of gathering a cargo. Our first object is to lay in stocks of rice for the slaves on the passage to the West Indies. You will naturally think it must be difficult to transact business with these people from ignorance of their language. But they have been for so many years trading with the English that all the traders have broken English enough for the purpose.
The transatlantic slave trade dominated West Africa. For some kingdoms, selling slaves became an economic necessity. And all along the coast, new trading settlements were springing up.
In the 17th century, the Atlantic slave trade became the most important activity on the coast. We find that almost every town, coastal town, and almost every European fort and castle was involved in slave trading. So we have about 65 slave markets in Ghana alone.
The Africans could hardly have anticipated the consequences of all this, but the bargain they struck with the European slave traders transformed the continent. What started as a local tradition turned into a monster that eventually swallowed 12 million people.
Slavery existed in societies that had no prison systems. It was part of the punitive measures against criminal conduct, criminal behavior. The slaves lost their liberty. They went away, maybe into the neighboring state or the neighboring nation, but only for a season. It was not a long-term loss of liberty. And the children of the slaves, of course, were never slaves in that context. But here, of course, with the transatlantic slave trade, you have a final separation. People went away and they never came back.
Slavery would spirit millions away from the continent. It would be the cause of war and torment. And it would drag both Africa and Europe into a harsh new era. By the 18th century, the coastal towns of West Africa were making vast profits. But the price paid by Africans was enormous. The slaves were suffering treatment they had never endured before.
In the indigenous system, especially in Ghana, no slave owner had the power of life and death over the slave. But in the castle, you could do anything to the slave. You could kill the slave, you could maim the slave, you could mutilate the slave, you could punish the slave as you liked.
Cape Coast Castle in modern Ghana, the headquarters of the Royal African Company, a place of misery and terror.
They lived in the dungeons as though they were animals, you know, so they weren't given enough food to eat. They were prisoners. We have the condemned cell where turbulent slaves were kept. And a lot of them were turbulent because, I mean, if you live in your country and somebody comes out here and takes you into captivity, you wouldn't take kindly to that.
Slaves were packed into every space. They could be trapped here for months. There were only two ways out, to the sea and the slave ships, or to the graveyard.
They had to go to the bathroom in the dungeons, they were fed in the dungeons. Their whole life was in the dungeons, and that was very uncomfortable, very unhealthy. There could be some epidemics, no windows. They really were confined to those little rooms.
the forts became a byword for cruelty and rape. The Europeans' moral restraint evaporated under the African sun.
Most of the colonial officials who came onto the coast came without their wives. So most of them became mistresses. They doubled up as domestic servants, as mistresses, concubines for these officials. For some of the female slaves who lived in the dungeons, the governor saw, in inverted commas, some of the female slaves. And when they were found pregnant, if they were lucky, they were set free.
The Europeans had no shame about declaring their conquests. In Cape Coast, families still carry names like Gonzalez, Coleman, Frith, and De Silva.
You had the European merchants intermarrying or having local African women, and their offspring, called the mulattoes, also growing in number. As the slaves were brought in, not everybody was sold and shipped off. Some remained. And so one would see a kind of a cosmopolitan life growing along the coast.
The West Africans tolerated the traders' brutality because European military backing gave them power, and they needed to import cheap brass and iron tools for farming and cooking. The Africans were always hunting for a better deal. It was the small English town of Bristol which offered that deal. Local mineral deposits gave the city a unique advantage. Bristol could make high-grade metal goods cheaply. Factories spread across the Avon Valley to meet the new African demand.
This is what's known as a guinea pan that was used as one of the trade items that filled the Bristol merchant ships that sailed to West Africa. And for several of these, one could exchange a slave in the early part of the 18th century. And it was because these small factories on the Avon Valley were able to develop an industrial structure to manufacture these large quantities cheaply that basically Bristol was able to develop a slave trade in the early 18th century.
Bristol's golden age was dawning. The families who transformed the city used their wealth to buy huge estates. Abraham Elton's descendants still live in his stately home, Clevedon Court.
Well, he was very much a self-made man. He came from a rather humble background. He was apprenticed to a mariner and became a master mariner, but clearly had a strong entrepreneurial flair and finally became a merchant.
Abraham spotted the opportunities in metals. He bought land bearing extensive deposits of copper and began to search for new markets.
He was looking for an outlet for his copper products. He had the raw materials for the business, he had the copper works, he had an outlet with the Bristol brass industry for the copper, but naturally he was looking for wider markets.
Abraham's seafaring connections told him that Africans would pay good money for high-grade brass. He seized the opportunity.
A wide number of people were involved in stocking the slave ships. So something that seems completely unconnected to the slave trade, such as the brass industry, was actually very much geared to an export market to the West African coast, because West African warlords wanted brass pots. And so most of the brass pots were directed for what they called the Guinea trade.
Abraham was an aggressive cost cutter. He and others spotted that with a simple redesign, the ships that took their metal goods to Africa could also carry slaves to the Caribbean. They could then bring back sugar to England. At a stroke, their costs were slashed and their profits doubled. Their insight gave birth to the triangular trade.
What you tried to do was to fill your ships on the outward journey to Africa. You would then be paid for the slaves you took on the next leg of the journey, and then the third leg bringing the sugar and the tobacco back and the rum back to Bristol, which you then sold on. so that you minimized, as far as you could, your financial risks.
The Bristol merchants had succeeded in surpassing the Royal African Company. They gave the African customers what they wanted at half the price.
It was not an exchange of unequals. It was an exchange of equals. One must remember that many of these African societies were very complex, they're very urban in places. Some of the cities were very large, and therefore they were not going to have shoddy European goods. So it required great skill in getting the right sorts of commodities, and the Bristol merchants in particular were very skilled at bringing together these different items which were acceptable for trade.
The breakthrough in Bristol sent slave trade profits soaring. The city's restless merchants would use those profits to begin an historic shift in British life, the Industrial Revolution. Among Abraham Elton's circle of friends was Thomas Goldney, who had made a fortune from a single successful voyage. He ploughed some of the money into the work of an old family friend, Abraham Darby. Darby was experimenting with new ways of making high-grade iron goods. He moved his works to Shropshire, where he started to smelt iron with coke, a revolutionary process. The iron produced in Coalbrookdale was tough enough to make tools that would not bend or break. It opened the way to the modern age.
These experiments took place in 1709, and they're generally considered to be the point, the defining moment at which the Industrial Revolution begins. What developed was a remarkable partnership between the people who had the know-how on the one hand and the people who had the money on the other. What the Shropshire ironmasters were trying to do was to find a source of coke-fired bar iron that was acceptable to the African market. And it was this, to some extent, that inspired the industrial developments that took place.
The Goldney-Darby partnership also inspired Ironbridge, the cradle of the Industrial Revolution. This great leap forward is usually attributed to the native genius of British engineers, but it owed much to the demands of the African trade.
As to say, many times we do wonder why Africa is left poor. Many times we do wonder why Africans are suffering. But then, going back to history, we definitely tell you what is happening in Africa. I'm not talking about the exploitation of Europeans, the invasion of Europeans. I'm talking about the current situation of Africa. Whatever Europeans might have exploited from Africa is a history. And as long as I know, I still maintain that Africans still have so much resources, minerals, and population to make things and life better for their people. But then what is happening in Africa? Why are there so much poverty in Africa? This is a question many of our kings, leaders, many of African presidents need to answer. Why is Africa poor? Why is Africa suffering despite how blessed the continent is? Why are there so much poverty? Why are there so much suffering in Africa? All the leaders, kings, governors, and presidents of African continents need to answer this question. Why is Africa the way they are? Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. One love.